Hey guys, we've got quite the competition on our hands today. We have a red hot Grand Seiko with a gorgeous vertical Japanese wood floored pattern dial versus this cool blue Omega with a beautiful teak deck horizontal pattern. These are both very storied watch brands, and these watches are both very good one watch collection, all-arounder, great value watches. What happens when we pit them against each other? We're going to discuss the value of a Grand Seiko versus an Omega and determine whether or not the Grand Seiko Premium is, of course, worth your money and your time. Let's do it. Let's start off by talking a little bit about these two brands. And now I'm not going to pit Grand Seiko versus Omega, the brand itself, against each other because they really represent two very different things. Now, Grand Seiko, which is now an entity of its own, separate from Seiko, is really the pinnacle branch of Seiko's watchmaking, seeking perfection, but still encompassing the same values. Essentially, the goal is to get the best bang for buck watch at its price point. Except instead of a couple of $100 like your typical Seiko, this is a couple $1,000. This Grand Seiko, for example, retails for $6,300, and many will call you crazy for spending that kind of money on a watch with Seiko written on it. But we're in a world where, luxury items cost 80% more for every 20% in craftsmanship, polishing, and furnishing improvement. But no one, in my opinion, does this quite efficiently as Grand Seiko. And we're going to use this video to compare why that is. On the other hand, we have the Omega. Now, Omega, of course, a very storied brand, rich in heritage. I would say before the quartz crisis, ironically triggered by Seiko, people weren't asking about Rolex watches. They were asking about Omega timepieces because Omega is so rich in history and has done so much to push the boundaries of horology. Obviously, the first watch on the moon was an Omega Speedmaster, one of the most iconic watches of all time. And even today, Omega has a very strong presence. It's part of the Swatch Group conglomerate, but it still remains a very popular brand and is the official timekeeper by the likes of the Olympic Games. So certainly the brand presence is there and the history is there. So let's go ahead and talk about the visual appeal, the dial, the finishing, and the case between these two watches. We'll start with the Grand Seiko. Now, you're not going to beat Grand Seiko in terms of value when you have a discussion about dials and furnishing. This dial is just a dial like none other, very similar to many of Grand Seiko's models. It is an extremely three-dimensional dial. You're really going to wake up every morning and see a different angle of it, and it's just so dynamic. Plays very well with the light. It's not just a simple stamped pattern. It has ridges, it has ribs. At the micro level, you're going to see something different every time you look at this watch. The dial furnishings are also a very high polish, diamond tipped polish, multifaceted to capture light. The case here is, of course, polished with Grand Seiko's famous Zaratsu polishing technique. You have this mirror-like finish, and you can see how easily my finger glides through the polished surfaces of this case, despite having many scratches on it. So, you're really getting a finishing level multiples higher than what this watch actually costs. Let's compare this to the Omega. And full disclaimer, the Omega retails for $5,500, so it's nearly $1,000 cheaper. And Omega has a gray market, which means you could get these bad boys for an even lower price, whereas Grand Seiko, no real gray market out there. So you're going to have to pay retail price or at a very slim discount if you're trying to go for a Grand Seiko. Acknowledging the price difference, though, Omega really doesn't fall as far behind as I would expect. This teak deck dial is also very dynamic, plays very well with the light. Its execution is not nearly as complex as the Grand Seiko. You can see here a fairly simple sunburst pattern. But the dial furnishings are actually quite impressive to me. These hour markers are not just simple high polished markers. They're lume filled, but also have a additional graining layer on top that just adds an extra flair, an extra type of reflective surface to this watch that really makes it a lot more dynamic. I in particular like how the Omega applied logo here just stands out and captures the light almost at all angles, and really just is gorgeous to play with. Again, has a grained surface on top. It's not just a simple polish. So definitely attention to detail here from Omega's end. Great value watch. Punches also above its cost. Now the finishing here, not nearly as impressive as the Seiko. Competently polished, also quite scratched from daily wear, but you can certainly tell the difference when you look at the two in person. Let's move on with the movement between the two, because it's what's inside that counts, right? So inside the Grand Seiko, you have an in-house caliber 9S85. It's 55 hours power reserve, +5, -3 seconds movement, regulated in 6 positions instead of 5, like the COSE standard. So very competently regulated movement here. Some, industrially finished as well. It is blocked by the special limited edition rotor, which is kind of creative on Grand Seiko's end. Nothing too special about the movement in terms of finishing and in terms of specs. What is a little unique about this movement and all of Grand Seiko's mechanical movements is that this is a high beat movement. So it beats at 36,000 beats per hour. So let's compare that beat rate to the Omega, which beats at approximately 25,000 beats per hour. What you're going to get with the Grand Seiko movement is a much smoother sweeping of the seconds hand. And it also has some accuracy implications as well. You're going to get more resistance to shock and just a higher legibility when you have a higher beat rate, like with the Grand Seiko. So may not be able to tell on the camera, but you can certainly tell in person that the Grand Seiko's second sweep is just smoother and more graceful than the Omega. I will say this movement's been used for decades now, I think over 25 years by Grand Seiko. And so from a value standpoint, I think the movement in terms of specs and upgrades is probably one of the weak points of Grand Seiko. They really have just been changing the dials and case designs over the years and using the same base movement. Now on to the Omega. What you're going to get is the Omega Coaxial 8800 movement, and this is a unique movement to Omega, also in-house. The coaxial escapement system is a modification from standard escapement systems and watches. So I like that this is unique to Omega. This is pushing the boundaries of watchmaking, and it's kind of cool that you're getting a piece that is very unique to Omega in this watch. And the finishing, while it is industrial, is quite competent. I would say the Grand Seiko gets a point here as well. You can see the base plate doesn't even have perlage on it. A lot of unfinished parts, and the movement itself doesn't quite look that polished. So really, from a finishing standpoint, I think credit to Grand Seiko here. But this movement of Omega also boasts the latest and greatest technology and materials, making it essentially amagnetic and extremely resistant to shock. So I definitely feel more comfortable bringing out this Omega to a sporting event or to swimming compared to the Grand Seiko, while they're both over 100 meters water resistant. So I would actually give the Omega the point here when we are talking technical specs and innovation for the movement. So what do I think when comparing these two gorgeous watches? Both extremely high value, great bang for buck, almost perfect one watch collections. I'm going to have to say that the Grand Seiko, at $1,000 more than the Omega retail, certainly provides you a lot more value in terms of craftsmanship. Now, on the other hand, in my personal opinion, if I had to choose only one watch to wear the rest of my life, I think I would have to go with the Omega. It's just more robust. I said brands doesn't matter, but when we're talking about a one watch collection, the Omega brand recognition, in my opinion, does the trick just more for me. If you have a base collection already, get the Grand Seiko. It's the better value for money. It's a unique piece to edge out your collection. But if you're looking for only one watch for the rest of your life, I would have to go with the Omega. So what do you guys think of my opinions and the comparison between these two watches? Feel free to leave a comment below.